Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Today, we're diving into one of the most mind-blowing what-if scenarios in all of human history. I'm talking about a single battle that could have completely flipped World War II on its head and changed literally everything about the world we live in today. So settle in, because this story is going to take us on a journey that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about how close we came to living in a completely different reality. Picture this. It's 1942, and there's a city sitting like a dagger pointed straight at the heart of Soviet Russia. This isn't just any city. This is Stalingrad, where the mighty Volga River makes a dramatic bend toward the Caspian Sea. And here's what's wild about this place. It literally controlled the lifeblood of an entire empire. Now, I want you to imagine the scale we're talking about here. This industrial giant was pumping out one tank every 4 hours. Every 4 hours. While you're having lunch, taking a nap, or watching a movie, another 34 tank was rolling off the production lines in Stalingrad. These weren't just any tanks either. They were churning out these war machines faster than Germany could destroy them. Think about that for a second. The city was basically a non-stop tank factory that kept Stalin's war machine breathing. The city stretched 48 kilometers along the riverbank, 2,000 to last. That's like driving from one end of Manhattan to the other, then doing it again, and still having room left over. And every inch of those 48 kilometers was humming with round-the-clock production that kept the Soviet war effort alive. Here's what makes this even more incredible. 500,000 people lived in this industrial powerhouse. 500,000 souls who had transformed their home from what started as a modest trading post into nothing less than the Soviet Union's industrial crown jewel. And the craziest part? Joseph Stalin himself had personally overseen its development during the 1930s. Picture Stalin, one of the most powerful men on earth, pouring massive resources into this city. He built enormous tractor plants that, when war came, flipped a switch and started producing tanks instead of farm equipment. The Henschel Aircraft Factory, the Red October Steel Works, the Barricade Gun Factory, DSA. These weren't just buildings scattered around the city. They were the beating heart of Soviet resistance against Nazi Germany. But here's where geography becomes destiny, and this is the part that'll blow your mind. Adolf Hitler looked at his maps, and Stalingrad became absolutely irresistible to him. Not because of the name, though that definitely got under his skin, but because of what controlling this single city could accomplish. Control Stalingrad and Germany could. Sever the vital supply routes, bringing oil from the Caucasus, food from the fertile south, and reinforcements from the east. We're talking about choking off the arteries that kept the entire Soviet war machine pumping. The Volga River alone carried 60% of Soviet oil supplies. 60%! That's like cutting off more than half the blood supply to a beating heart. So imagine Hitler's thinking here. Capture Stalingrad and he could literally choke the entire Soviet war effort, while simultaneously opening the path to the oil fields that would fuel his war machine for decades to come. It wasn't just about taking a city. It was about grabbing the keys to the entire kingdom. Now, let me paint you a picture of what this place actually looked like. The city had become this incredible fusion of old and new Russia. You had ancient Orthodox churches, with their golden domes, sitting right next to massive industrial complexes, belching smoke into the sky. Workers lived in apartment blocks that Stalin had built right alongside the factories, so the sounds of production never stopped. Day or night, you could hear the hammering, the grinding, the roar of furnaces turning raw materials into instruments of war. The Volga River itself was like a highway of strategic importance. Imagine standing on the western bank and looking across this massive waterway. To art. It's not just a river. It's a natural barrier that splits European Russia from the Asian steppes beyond. Control the crossing points, and you control the movement of entire armies, the flow of supplies, the fate of millions. But here's what's truly wild about the situation in 1942. The Soviet Union was hanging on by a thread. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of Russia that started in June 1941 had been a catastrophe for Stalin's forces. We're talking about losses so massive they're hard to comprehend. Millions of soldiers captured or killed, thousands of tanks destroyed, entire army groups simply wiped off the map. Yet somehow, impossibly, the Soviets were still fighting, and Stalingrad was a huge reason why. Every tank that rolled out of those factories, every gun barrel forged in those steel works, every aircraft assembled in those plants, it all kept flowing to the front lines, keeping Soviet resistance alive when by all logic it should have collapsed. The workers in Stalingrad weren't just building weapons, they were racing against time itself. Factory managers pushed production schedules to the absolute limit. Workers pulled shifts that would make modern labor laws weep. Women who had never touched industrial machinery before found themselves operating complex tank assembly lines. Teenagers too young for military service became expert welders and metalworkers. And here's something that'll give you chills. Many of these factory workers knew that the war was coming closer every day. They could hear the distant rumble of artillery, getting louder each week. They knew German armies were advancing across the steppes toward their city, but they kept working. They kept those production lines moving, even as the sound of war crept closer to their doorstep. The strategic calculations on both sides were absolutely fascinating. Soviet military planners looked at Stalingrad and saw their Gibraltar, a fortress city that could anchor their entire defensive line along the Volga. Lose Stalingrad, and they'd have to fall back hundreds of kilometers to the next natural defensive barrier. That would mean abandoning not just the city's industrial capacity, but also the rich agricultural regions of southern Russia that fed the Soviet war machine. From Hitler's perspective, the math was equally compelling but for opposite reasons. Take Stalingrad, and suddenly Army Group South could wheel through the Caucasus like a knife through butter, capturing oil fields that would solve Germany's fuel crisis permanently. The Wehrmacht ran on petroleum, just like every modern army, and those Caucasus oil fields represented the difference between a war machine that could keep fighting indefinitely and one that would eventually grind to a halt from fuel starvation. But there was something else driving Hitler's obsession with this particular city, something that went beyond pure military logic. The city bore Stalin's name. It had been renamed Stalingrad in 1925 to honor the Soviet dictator's role in defending it during the Russian Civil War. For Hitler, capturing a city named after his greatest rival wasn't just strategic, it was personal. It was symbolic. It was the ultimate prize that would demonstrate Nazi superiority over communist ideology. Think about the propaganda value for a moment. Imagine Nazi newsreels showing German soldiers marching through the streets of Stalingrad, swastika flags flying where Stalin's name had once been celebrated. The psychological impact on Soviet morale would have been devastating. If Stalin's own city could fall, what hope remained for the rest of the Soviet Union? The industrial infrastructure that made Stalingrad so valuable also made it incredibly complex to capture. This wasn't some medieval fortress you could surround and starve into submission. This was a modern industrial city with multiple districts, each containing factories that were almost like cities within the city. The tractor plant alone employed tens of thousands of workers and covered an area larger than many entire towns. Each factory complex had its own power systems, its own transportation networks, its own defensive possibilities. The Red October steelworks sat right on the Volga riverbank, with rail lines and loading docks that could be turned into fortress positions. The Barricade gun factory had thick concrete walls designed to contain industrial explosions, walls that could just as easily contain attacking armies. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Soviet defenders were already thinking about how to use this industrial landscape for military purposes. They were pre-positioning ammunition in factory basements, setting up observation posts in factory towers, and planning how to turn every workshop into a fortress if the Germans arrived. As we'll see in our next chapter, Hitler was about to make a decision that would determine not just the fate of Stalingrad, but potentially the entire course of human history. He faced a choice that went against every principle of military strategy, a gamble so enormous that it could either win him the war in one massive stroke or destroy his armies in the attempt. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in early 1942, Stalingrad stands as this incredible symbol of Soviet industrial might, this prize so valuable that both Hitler and Stalin were willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives to control it. A city that produced the weapons of war while bearing the name of one dictator, targeted by another dictator who saw it as the key to global domination. The stage was set for what would become the most brutal, most decisive urban battle in human history, a battle that would determine whether Nazi Germany achieved the resources it needed to win World War II, or whether the Soviet Union would find the strength to begin pushing Hitler's armies back toward Berlin. And here's the thing that should keep you awake at night. It could have gone either way. The margin between victory and defeat, between the world we know and a completely different reality where Nazi Germany dominated the globe, came down to decisions made in the rubble-filled streets of one industrial city on the banks of the Volga River. So here we are in the summer of 1942, and let me tell you, this is where things get absolutely wild. The German war machine had literally devoured most of Europe by this point. I mean, think about it. In just 3 years, Hitler's armies had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. It's almost hard to believe when you list it all out like that. But here's the thing that was driving Hitler absolutely crazy. Victory in Russia remained tantalizingly out of reach. And I mean tantalizingly, like when you're trying to grab something that's just barely beyond your fingertips. Operation Barbarossa, that massive invasion of the Soviet Union that had started in June 1941, had been both a stunning success and a catastrophic failure at the same time. Get this. Operation Barbarossa had destroyed 3 million Soviet soldiers in just 6 months. 3 million! That's like wiping out the entire population of Chicago. The German war machine had captured or killed more enemy soldiers than most countries even had in their entire armies. Yet somehow, impossibly, Stalin's forces just kept fighting. Now, you're probably thinking what Hitler was thinking at this point. How is that even possible? How do you lose 3 million soldiers and still have an army left to fight with? Well, here's the terrifying reality that was slowly dawning on German leadership. The Soviet Union was just massive beyond anything they had imagined. Stalin could replace those 3 million soldiers and still have millions more in reserve. But Hitler, being Hitler, wasn't about to admit that maybe he'd bitten off more than he could chew. Instead, he convinced himself that one more massive push would finally bring the Soviet Union to its knees. And this is where he faced a choice that would literally determine the fate of his empire, and potentially the entire world. Picture Hitler standing over those huge military maps in his headquarters, staring at the front lines that stretched across 2,000 kilometers of Eastern Europe. His generals are telling him to concentrate everything on Moscow, knock out the Soviet capital, and win the war with one decisive blow. Makes sense, right? That's military strategy 101. Concentrate your forces and strike at the enemy's center of power. But Hitler had become obsessed with something else entirely. He looked at those maps and saw 2 prizes that he absolutely had to have: Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. And here's where he made a decision that went against every military principle ever written. Instead of choosing one objective and concentrating his forces, he decided to go for both. Now, I want you to understand just how crazy this decision was. It's like trying to catch 2 baseballs that are flying in opposite directions. You might be talented enough to catch one, but trying to catch both means you'll probably miss them both and look like an idiot in the process. Against every piece of advice from his military experts, Hitler chose both targets. Army Group South, which was already the largest military formation in human history, got split into 2 massive pincers. Army Group A would race toward the oil fields of Baku, while Army Group B would drive toward Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht, which was already stretched across front lines extending 2,000 kilometers, that's like stretching from New York to Denver, now faced what can only be described as a logistics nightmare that would make modern supply chain managers have panic attacks. Here's where the math starts getting really ugly, and I mean really ugly. Every single day, German supply trucks had to travel 800 kilometers through hostile territory just to reach the front lines. 800 kilometers. That's like driving from Chicago to Nashville, except you're doing it through territory where Soviet partisans are blowing up bridges, sabotaging railways, and turning every supply convoy into a deadly gamble. And the fuel consumption? Oh man, this is where it gets insane. Each panzer division consumed 500 tons of fuel daily. 500 tons. That's like 1,000 cars worth of gasoline every single day, just for one division. And Germany had dozens of these divisions spread across the Eastern Front. General Franz Halder, who was the chief of the German General Staff, AP2, basically the guy responsible for making sure the math worked, watched his carefully calculated supply equations collapse in real time. Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad was literally overruling basic mathematical reality. You can't supply massive armies across enormous distances when you're splitting your forces and attacking multiple objectives simultaneously. It's just not physically possible. But here's the really fascinating part, and this is where you start to see how personalities and egos can literally change the course of history. Hitler had become personally fixated on Stalingrad not just because of its strategic value, but because of its name. This wasn't just another city to him. This was Stalin's city, and capturing it would be the ultimate humiliation of his present tourney, greatest enemy. Meanwhile, the German Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, was advancing towards Stalingrad with what looked like an absolutely formidable force. We're talking about 250,000 men, 700 tanks, and over 1,000 artillery pieces. On paper, this was more than enough firepower to capture any city on Earth. But here's where the story gets really interesting. And this is the kind of detail that makes you realize how much of history comes down to hidden weaknesses that nobody sees coming. Behind this impressive German force lurked a fatal flaw that would eventually doom the entire operation. You see, the German Sixth Army's flanks, ISA, those are the sides of the army that needed protection from enemy attacks, depended on Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. Now, these weren't necessarily bad soldiers, but they were equipped with obsolete weapons and had received minimal training compared to German forces. It was like having a championship football team where the offensive line was made up of high school players. Why did this happen? Well, here's the ugly reality of Hitler's alliance system. Germany simply didn't have enough soldiers to man the entire Eastern Front with German troops, so they had to rely on their allies to fill the gaps. But these allies didn't have the same equipment, the same training, or frankly, the same motivation to fight and die for Hitler's vision of German domination. The Romanian Third Army and the Hungarian Second Army were stretched along hundreds of kilometers of front line, holding positions with World War I-era equipment, while facing an enemy that was desperate, determined, and fighting for their homeland. It was a recipe for disaster, but Hitler was so focused on capturing Stalingrad that he chose to ignore this massive vulnerability. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Soviet intelligence knew about this weakness. Stalin's spies and reconnaissance units had identified exactly where these weaker Allied forces were positioned. They were already making plans to exploit this vulnerability, but Hitler either didn't know or didn't care. His attention was completely focused on the prize of Stalingrad. And let's talk about Friedrich Paulus for a moment, because this guy is about to become one of the most tragic figures in military history. Paulus was a highly competent general, the kind of methodical, professional officer that the German army prided itself on producing. He understood logistics, he understood tactics, and he understood the enormous challenges his army was about to face. But Paulus also understood something else. You don't say no to Adolf Hitler and keep your job, or your life, for that matter. So when Hitler ordered him to capture Stalingrad, Paulus saluted and started planning how to accomplish what was essentially an impossible mission with insufficient resources across impossible distances. The German advance toward Stalingrad in the summer of 1942 was like watching a massive machine slowly running out of fuel while still moving forward. Every kilometer they advanced took them further from their supply bases. Every day that passed gave the Soviets more time to prepare defenses. Every gallon of fuel they burned was a gallon they couldn't replace easily. But here's what makes this story so gripping. It almost worked anyway. German engineering and military professionalism were so superior at this point in the war that they nearly overcame impossible odds through sheer competence and determination. The Wehrmacht was still the most effective military machine on the planet, and when they focused their attention on a target, cities fell. Soviet forces were retreating across the steppes, trying to delay the German advance while avoiding complete destruction. It looked like Stalingrad would fall just like every other city the Germans had targeted. The Red Army was clearly outmatched in equipment, training, and tactical sophistication. But Stalin was making his own desperate calculations. He looked at the map and realized that if Stalingrad fell, the entire southern front would collapse. The oil fields of the Caucasus would be defenseless. The Volga River supply line would be severed. The war might be over, and not in a good way for the Soviet Union. So Stalin started moving every available reserve toward Stalingrad. Fresh divisions from Siberia, hastily trained militia units from the cities, anyone who could hold a rifle was being funneled toward the Volga. It was going to be the ultimate showdown between German military efficiency and Soviet desperation. And here's the crazy part. Neither side really understood what they were getting into. Urban warfare on this scale had never been attempted before. Nobody knew how to fight a battle for control of a modern industrial city. There were no textbooks, no previous examples, no established tactics for this kind of tactics. Combat. What was about to happen in Stalingrad would literally rewrite the book on modern warfare. But first, the German war machine had to actually reach the city. And, as we'll see in our next chapter, that final approach to Stalingrad would transform what started as a conventional military campaign into something that resembled a descent into hell itself. The fate of the world was about to be decided in the rubble-filled streets of one industrial city, and nobody, not Hitler, not Stalin, not the generals on either side, really understood what they were about to unleash. Okay, so here's where our story takes a turn that's going to absolutely blow your mind. We're about to witness the moment when conventional warfare died and something completely new and terrifying was born in its place. August 23rd, 1942. Picture this scene. It's a beautiful summer morning in Stalingrad. People are going about their daily routines, heading to work in the factories, children playing in the streets. The war feels distant, even though everyone knows the Germans are getting closer. And then, suddenly, the sky turns black. 600 German bombers appeared over Stalingrad like a swarm of metallic locusts. 600. To put that in perspective, that's more aircraft than most countries had in their entire air force. The Luftwaffe had assembled the largest bombing raid in the history of warfare up to that point, and they were about to drop it all on one city. In the first attack alone, these bombers dropped 18,000 bombs. 18,000. Imagine the sound, not just the roar of 600 aircraft engines, but the screaming whistle of 18,000 bombs falling from the sky all at once. People who survived that day said the noise was so overwhelming that it felt like the world itself was being torn apart. The city erupted in flames that could be seen from 100 kilometers away. 100 kilometers. That's like standing in Philadelphia and seeing a fire in New York City. Oil storage tanks exploded like volcanic eruptions, sending pillars of fire 300 meters into the air. That's taller than the Eiffel Tower. The heat was so intense that it created its own weather system, with winds swirling around the burning city. And here's the part that'll give you chills. 40,000 civilians died in that first day alone. 40,000 people who woke up that morning thinking about work, about their families, about ordinary daily concerns, and by sunset they were gone. Entire apartment blocks collapsed with families still inside. Schools, hospitals, churches, nothing was spared. But here's where this story takes the most incredible twist, and this is the part that changed everything. The German bombing campaign was designed to destroy Stalingrad's ability to resist. It was supposed to crush morale, eliminate defensive positions, and pave the way for an easy German victory. Instead, it created exactly the opposite effect. The bombing transformed Stalingrad into the most formidable urban fortress in military history. Every collapsed building became a bunker. Every crater provided cover, Every pile of rubble created hiding places where Soviet defenders could ambush advancing Germans from hidden positions. The destruction that was supposed to help the Germans actually made their job infinitely harder. Think about it this way. When you destroy a building, you don't make it disappear. You turn it into a massive pile of concrete and steel that's actually much harder to get through than the original building was. Soviet soldiers could tunnel through the rubble, create firing positions behind chunks of concrete, and pop up to attack German forces from directions they never expected. Enter General Vasily Chuikov, and this guy is about to become a legend. Chuikov arrived to command the Soviet 62nd Army with orders that tolerated absolutely no retreat, not one step backward. That was literally his orders from Stalin. His headquarters occupied a bunker carved directly from the Volga riverbank, connected to the city by a single ferry route that German artillery was pounding constantly. Picture Chuikov's situation for a moment. He's commanding an army from a hole in the ground while shells are exploding overhead 24 hours a day. His only supply line is a ferry crossing that's under constant bombardment. Supplies could only arrive at night. Ammunition, food, medical equipment, and reinforcements had to cross the Volga River under continuous German fire. The ferry system became legendary among Soviet forces. These weren't big, armoured military transports, 2020. They were often just small boats and improvised rafts that had to navigate across the Volga while German artillery tried to blow them out of the water. The crews who ran these supply missions had a life expectancy measured in days, not months. But here's what's absolutely incredible. They kept doing it. Night after night, these supply runs continued. Soviet soldiers would load boats with ammunition and medical supplies, knowing there was a huge chance they wouldn't survive the crossing. And they did it anyway because they understood that without those supplies, the entire defense would collapse. Now, let me describe what the fighting in Stalingrad actually looked like, because this was unlike anything that had ever happened in military history. The German army had perfected something called combined arms warfare, tanks, artillery, and infantry, working together to overwhelm enemy positions. It was incredibly effective in open terrain, and it's how they had conquered most of Europe. But Stalingrad turned all of that upside down. The rubble made it impossible for tanks to maneuver effectively. Artillery was less useful because the targets were hidden in basements and tunnels. Instead, the fighting evolved into something unprecedented. German soldiers had to advance meter by meter, fighting for individual rooms, staircases, even toilet facilities. The Soviets created what they called killing houses, buildings that were rigged with explosives and hidden firing positions that could slaughter entire German squads before they even realized what was happening. Soviet engineers became experts at turning ordinary apartment buildings into death traps. Here's how it worked. Soviet defenders would let German forces advance into a building, sometimes even retreating to upper floors to make it look like they were giving up. Then, once the Germans were inside and spread throughout the building, hidden Soviet soldiers would emerge from concealed positions and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Germans would find themselves trapped in narrow hallways and stairwells where their superior equipment and training advantages meant nothing. The average life expectancy of a Soviet lieutenant dropped to 3 days. 3 days. Think about that. You'd graduate from military school, get assigned to Stalingrad, and statistically, you'd be dead before the weekend. But new officers kept volunteering for these assignments because they understood what was at stake. But it wasn't just the officers who were dying quickly. Ordinary soldiers on both sides were being ground up in this urban meat grinder at rates that were almost incomprehensible. German units that entered Stalingrad with full strength would be reduced to a handful of survivors within weeks. Soviet regiments would be completely destroyed and then rebuilt with new recruits, only to be destroyed again. And then there's the sniper warfare, which reached absolutely legendary proportions during the Battle of Stalingrad. The most famous of these was Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Urals who had learned to shoot by hunting wolves in the Siberian wilderness. Zaitsev killed 242 German soldiers with carefully aimed shots, often waiting motionless, for hours to get the perfect opportunity. But here's where it gets really dramatic. German command became so frustrated with Zaitsev's success that they sent their finest marksman, Major Koenig, specifically to eliminate him. What followed was a deadly duel that lasted for days among the ruins of Stalingrad, IR. Two expert snipers hunting each other through the destroyed city, each trying to get the first shot that would end the other's life. The sniper duel became symbolic of the entire battle. It wasn't just about armies anymore. It was personal, intimate, deadly combat where individual skill and determination could influence the outcome of the entire war. Zaitsev eventually won that duel, and the psychological impact on German forces was enormous. But here's something that made everything even worse for both sides. Winter arrived early in 1942. We're talking about temperatures that plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Minus 40? That's cold enough to freeze. Exposed skin in minutes. Cold enough to make metal so brittle it shatters. Cold enough to turn the Volga River into solid ice. German soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms because their supply lines couldn't get winter equipment to the front. Picture German troops fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad while wearing light cotton uniforms in temperatures cold enough to kill you just from exposure. Their weapons jammed because the metal contracted in the cold. Their vehicles wouldn't start because the fuel literally froze solid. Frostbite casualties started exceeding combat losses in many German units. Soldiers were losing fingers and toes to the cold faster than they were losing them to Soviet bullets. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with cases of severe frostbite and hypothermia. But the Soviets weren't immune to the cold either. They were better equipped for winter fighting because they were used to Russian winters, but they were also living in the ruins of their own city, without proper shelter. Soviet soldiers were sleeping in bombed-out basements with no heating, eating frozen rations, and fighting while suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. The battle turned into a contest of pure endurance. Which side could absorb more punishment? Which army could keep fighting longer under impossible conditions? It wasn't about tactical brilliance anymore. It was about who could suffer more and still keep pulling the trigger. And here's what's truly incredible about this whole situation. Neither side could afford to lose. For the Germans, Stalingrad had become a symbol of Nazi invincibility. If they couldn't capture one Soviet city, how could they claim to be conquering the world? For the Soviets, Stalingrad was literally the last line of defense. If the city fell, the entire southern front would collapse, and the war might be over. So both sides kept pouring more troops into this urban hellscape. Fresh German divisions would arrive, march into the ruins, and disappear into the fighting. New Soviet regiments would cross the Volga at night and vanish into the rubble. The city was devouring armies like some kind of industrial-scale meat grinder. As winter deepened and the fighting intensified, something was about to happen that would shock the world and change the entire course of the war. But that's where our story takes its most dramatic turn. Because what if things had gone differently? What if the German war machine had actually broken through? What if Hitler's gamble had paid off? In our next chapter, we're going to explore that alternate timeline, and I guarantee it'll make you think about just how different our world could have been if a few key moments in the ruins of Stalingrad had gone the other way. Alright, so now we're going to dive into something that's going to absolutely blow your mind. We're about to explore what might be the most chilling alternate timeline in human history. So buckle up, because we're going to imagine a world where everything went wrong, where Hitler's desperate gamble actually paid off. Picture this scenario. It's November 1942, and instead of being trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, German flags are flying over the Volga riverbank. After 3 months of the most hellish fighting in military history, Friedrich Paulus has somehow broken through. Soviet resistance has finally been crushed, and the German Sixth Army controls the most strategic city in European Russia. Now, I want you to think about what this means, because the ripple effects would have been absolutely catastrophic for the rest of human history. This isn't just about one city changing hands. This is about reshaping the entire trajectory of World War II and everything that came after. With Stalingrad captured, Hitler suddenly gains control of the entire Volga transportation system. Remember, this river carried 60% of Soviet oil supplies. 60%. Imagine if someone cut off more than half of America's oil supply overnight, EVT. That's the kind of economic strangulation we're talking about. But it gets worse, much worse. The psychological impact on Soviet morale would have been absolutely devastating. Think about it from Stalin's perspective. If Stalingrad could fall, if his own city could be captured by the Germans, then nowhere in the Soviet Union was truly safe. The city that bore his name, the symbol of Soviet industrial might, was now flying Nazi flags. Here's where it gets really terrifying. Stalin's regime was already strained to the breaking point by catastrophic military losses. Millions of soldiers dead or captured, entire regions under German occupation. The economy focused completely on military production, while civilians starved. The fall of Stalingrad might have been the final straw that triggered internal rebellion. Picture ethnic minorities throughout the Soviet Union, Ukrainians, Chechens, Central Asian peoples who had been oppressed under Stalin's rule, suddenly seeing German victory as their opportunity for liberation. Instead of rallying around Soviet resistance, they might have risen up against Moscow's control, creating multiple civil wars within the larger world war. But let's follow the military consequences, because this is where things get absolutely wild. The German Sixth Army, instead of being destroyed in the ruins of Stalingrad, pivots south to support Army Group A's advance toward the Baku oil fields. Now you've got two massive German army groups advancing together through the Caucasus Mountains. By spring 1943, German tanks are rolling into Baku and capturing oil production facilities that could supply the Wehrmacht indefinitely. We're talking about some of the richest oil fields on Earth, capable of producing millions of barrels annually. Suddenly, Germany's chronic fuel shortage, 1.5, which was one of their biggest strategic weaknesses, disappears overnight. Think about what this means for German military capabilities. Those panzer divisions that were rationing fuel and limiting their operations, now they can operate at full capacity indefinitely. The Luftwaffe, which was already struggling to maintain flight operations due to fuel shortages, suddenly they can put every aircraft in the sky. But here's the truly nightmarish part. Soviet resistance starts collapsing like a house of cards. Without oil from the Caucasus, the Red Army can't fuel their tank armies. Soviet aircraft are grounded. The entire military machine that had been barely holding the line against German advances suddenly grinds to a halt. Stalin faces an impossible choice. He can either negotiate some kind of surrender with Hitler, or watch his entire country be conquered piece by piece. Given Stalin's personality, he probably would have chosen to fight to the bitter end, but his generals and political allies might have had other ideas. Internal coup attempts become very likely. Now, here's where this alternate timeline gets really scary for the rest of the world. With the Eastern Front stabilized and Soviet resistance neutralized, Hitler can transfer massive numbers of troops westward. We're talking about 40 divisions. That's roughly 500,000 veteran soldiers who have been fighting on the Eastern Front for 2 years. These troops get redeployed to strengthen the Atlantic Wall defenses along the French coast. When Allied forces attempt the D-Day landings in June 1944, instead of facing the historically accurate German defenders, they're confronting twice as many troops equipped with weapons funded by captured Soviet oil revenues. The D-Day invasion fails catastrophically. American, British, and Canadian forces are thrown back into the sea with enormous casualties. The political consequences in Britain and America are immediate and devastating. Churchill's government falls. Roosevelt faces enormous pressure to negotiate peace, and the entire Allied strategy of defeating Germany through a second front in Europe collapses. But wait, it gets worse. The war extends into 1946, 1947, maybe beyond. Without Soviet pressure drawing German forces eastward, Hitler has years of additional time to develop the advanced weapons his scientists were working on. We're talking about jet aircraft that were already in development, guided missiles that could strike targets hundreds of miles away, and possibly even atomic weapons. Here's something that'll give you nightmares. German rocket technology was already ahead of everyone else's by 1943. With additional years and unlimited oil revenues, They might have developed intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of hitting American cities from European launch sites. The V-2 rocket was just the beginning. German engineers were planning V-4 and V-5 rockets with much longer ranges and bigger payloads. Britain faces renewed bombing campaigns with revolutionary new weapons. Instead of the relatively primitive Von and V-2 rockets of actual history, German forces are launching massive bombardment campaigns with precision-guided missiles carrying payloads that could level entire city blocks. And here's the part that should absolutely terrify you. The United States, facing a prolonged European war with no end in sight, accelerates atomic bomb development and makes a horrifying decision. Instead of dropping nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, American bombers drop atomic bombs on German cities in 1946. Picture mushroom clouds rising over Berlin, Hamburg, or Munich. The first use of nuclear weapons in warfare happens in Europe instead of Asia, with completely different moral and political consequences. The precedent for using atomic weapons against white European populations instead of Asian populations changes. Everything about post-war international relations. But let's think about the Pacific Theater too, because that changes dramatically as well. Without the Soviet Union entering the war against Japan, MAD, which historically happened in August 1945, 2L, the Japanese fight longer and harder. The planned American invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, actually happens instead of being prevented by Japanese surrender. American casualties in the Pacific soar into the hundreds of thousands as they fight their way onto the Japanese home islands. The war in the Pacific extends well into 1946, with massive battles on the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu that make D-Day look like a minor skirmish. Japan, facing complete conquest, might resort to even more desperate measures. Biological weapons, kamikaze attacks on American cities using long-range aircraft, or submarine attacks on the American mainland. The entire character of the Pacific War becomes infinitely more brutal and destructive. And we haven't even talked about what happens to the Holocaust in this timeline. With German resources freed up by victory in the East, the Nazi extermination program accelerates and expands. Millions more people die in concentration camps that operate for additional years. The Jewish population of Europe is almost completely eliminated, along with other groups targeted by Nazi racial ideology. The post-war world looks completely different. Instead of American and Soviet superpowers facing off in a Cold War, you might have American and German superpowers dividing the world between them. Eastern Europe remains under Nazi control, with the horrors of that regime continuing for years or decades longer. Or maybe, and this is even more terrifying, Germany develops atomic weapons first and uses them against American cities. The entire nuclear age begins with Nazi Germany as the dominant atomic power, fundamentally altering the balance of global politics. Here's what really gets me about this alternate timeline. It was all possible. The margin between Nazi victory and defeat at Stalingrad was incredibly narrow. A few different tactical decisions, slightly different weather patterns, small changes in timing, any of these could have tipped the balance the other way. The world we live in today, where democracy survived and fascism was defeated, wasn't inevitable. It was the result of countless individual acts of courage, strategic brilliance, and yes, a fair amount of luck during those crucial months when the fate of civilization was being decided in the ruins of one industrial city. In our next chapter, we're going to explore how historians actually figure out these alternate scenarios. How do you study something that didn't happen? How do you separate plausible possibilities from pure fantasy? The methodology behind counterfactual history is absolutely fascinating, and it'll give you a whole new appreciation for just how contingent and fragile historical outcomes really are. So here's a question that's probably been bugging you. How do historians actually figure out these alternate scenarios without just making stuff up? I mean, we just spent an entire chapter exploring what might have happened if Stalingrad had fallen, but how do we know any of that is plausible versus pure science fiction? Well, let me walk you through something absolutely fascinating, the world of counterfactual history, where scholars have developed rigorous methods for peering into the shadows of possibility without losing themselves in fantasy. It's like detective work crossed with mathematical modeling, and the results will blow your mind. The process starts with something that might surprise you: primary sources. These historians aren't just sitting around imagining what might have been. They're diving deep into captured German documents, Soviet military records, weather data, production statistics, supply chain reports, and thousands of other pieces of hard evidence from the actual battle. Picture researchers spending years in archives, reading through Wehrmacht, planning documents that detail exactly how German forces intended to exploit a victory at Stalingrad. These aren't hypothetical plans. These are actual military orders that were prepared but never executed because the Germans lost the battle. For example, German Army Group A had detailed operational plans for advancing through the Caucasus once Stalingrad was secured. They had identified specific oil production facilities to capture, calculated fuel transportation requirements, and even planned administrative structures for governing conquered territories. All of this documentation survived the war and gives historians concrete evidence for modeling alternate outcomes. Now, this field of study has some heavyweight intellectual muscle behind it. Researchers like Geoffrey Hawthorne at Cambridge University and Niall Ferguson at Harvard developed methodologies that treat alternative history as serious scholarship rather than entertainment. They established rules for what counts as plausible speculation versus wishful thinking. The key concept is something called minimal rewrite scenarios. Instead of changing everything about a historical situation, you change as few variables as possible while tracking the cascading consequences. It's like changing one domino in a long chain and seeing how that affects all the dominoes that follow. At Stalingrad, historians have identified 3 specific factors that could realistically have altered the outcome. First, if the German assault had begun earlier in the summer, before Soviet reinforcements arrived in massive numbers. Second, if German forces had successfully captured the key ferry crossings that kept Soviet supplies flowing across the Volga. Third, if Soviet counteroffensive preparations had failed due to intelligence leaks or logistical problems. Each of these factors was historically plausible. German commanders were actually debating earlier assault timing. Ferry crossings were repeatedly attacked and nearly captured. Soviet counteroffensive plans were extremely risky and could easily have been disrupted. None of these represent fantasy scenarios. They're all within the realm of historical possibility. But here's where it gets really cool. Modern computer modeling allows historians to input thousands of variables and run simulations that reveal probability ranges for different outcomes. We're talking about troop strength data, weather patterns, supply tonnages, ammunition consumption rates, fuel requirements, casualty projections. Every quantifiable aspect of the battle gets fed into sophisticated mathematical models. The Battle of Stalingrad emerges from these simulations as what statisticians call a knife-edge scenario. Small changes in initial conditions produce dramatically different outcomes. The mathematical models show that German victory was entirely plausible given slightly different circumstances, which validates the alternate timeline scenarios we explored in the previous chapter. And here's something that'll blow your mind. Archaeological evidence continues refining our understanding of what actually happened, which in turn affects our modeling of what might have happened. Excavations in modern Volgograd regularly reveal new fighting positions, weapon caches, and personal effects that illuminate the battle's daily reality. Just last year, archaeologists discovered a previously unknown German command bunker that contained detailed tactical maps showing exactly how close German forces came to breaking through Soviet lines in November 1942. These maps revealed that German commanders believed they were within days of victory when the Soviet counteroffensive began. That's how narrow the margin really was. The archaeological discoveries also validate or challenge traditional narratives about the battle. For instance, metal detector surveys have revealed the density of artillery shell fragments in different city districts, which shows precisely where the heaviest fighting occurred and helps historians understand how battle lines shifted house by house through the urban battlefield. One of the most fascinating aspects of counterfactual methodology is something called convergence testing. Researchers approach the same alternate scenario from multiple angles: economic, military, political, technological, and see if their conclusions align. If different analytical approaches reach similar conclusions about plausible outcomes, that increases confidence in the scenario. For the Stalingrad alternate timeline, convergence testing has been remarkably consistent. Economic analyses of German resource requirements match military assessments of troop deployment possibilities. Political studies of Soviet morale factors align with strategic evaluations of defensive capabilities. When multiple, independent approaches reach the same conclusions, you know you're dealing with plausible possibilities rather than speculation. But historians also have to be incredibly careful about something called presentist bias, the tendency to assume that historical actors knew what we know now or would have made decisions based on hindsight. German commanders in 1942 didn't know they were going to lose the war. They made decisions based on information available at the time, not on knowledge of future events. This is where primary source documents become absolutely crucial. Reading actual German planning documents from 1942 reveals the assumptions, fears, and expectations that drove real historical decisions. These documents show that German commanders genuinely believed Stalingrad's capture would lead to Soviet collapse. It wasn't just Nazi propaganda, it was their actual strategic assessment. Similarly, Soviet documents reveal the desperate calculations being made in Moscow. Stalin's advisors were genuinely terrified that losing Stalingrad would trigger the collapse of the entire southern front. Their fears weren't irrational, they were based on hard military realities that made German victory scenarios entirely plausible. One of the most important developments in counterfactual methodology has been the integration of chaos theory and complexity science. These mathematical frameworks help historians understand how small changes can cascade into massive consequences through non-linear feedback loops. The Stalingrad scenario is a perfect example of what complexity theorists call a sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Tiny changes in timing, weather, or tactical decisions could have triggered cascading effects that reshaped the entire war. This isn't speculation. It's mathematical reality confirmed by multiple analytical approaches. Modern historians also use comparative analysis to test alternate scenarios. They study other historical cases where similar conditions produced different outcomes, then apply those patterns to Stalingrad. For instance, urban warfare in other conflicts provides data about how long defending forces can typically hold out under siege conditions. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days, under conditions arguably worse than Stalingrad. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising lasted 27 days against overwhelming odds. These comparative cases help historians understand the range of possible outcomes for urban resistance scenarios. But here's what makes the Stalingrad case unique. The global strategic implications were unlike any other single battle in history. Most urban warfare scenarios are locally decisive, but globally limited. Stalingrad was different because it sat at the intersection of so many critical strategic factors: oil resources, transportation networks, symbolic significance, and military momentum. That's why the counterfactual scenarios for German victory at Stalingrad are so dramatically different from alternate outcomes for other battles. Most what-if scenarios produce local or regional changes. Stalingrad had the potential to reshape global civilization. The methodology for studying these massive counterfactual scenarios requires what historians call nested modeling. You have to account for changes at multiple scales simultaneously. Local tactical outcomes affect regional strategic situations, which influence national political decisions, which reshape international relationships. It's like solving a puzzle where changing one piece forces you to reconsider every other piece in the puzzle. That's why counterfactual analysis of Stalingrad took decades to develop properly. The interconnections between different levels of analysis are incredibly complex. As we'll see in our next chapter, these methodological insights don't just help us understand the past. They're actively influencing how we think about historical memory, national identity, and the lessons we draw from pivotal moments in human history. The battle for Stalingrad continues to be fought in classrooms, political speeches, and international relations more than 80 years after the guns fell silent. Here's something that might surprise you. The Battle of Stalingrad didn't end when the guns stopped firing in February 1943. In many ways, that battle is still being fought today, just on different battlefields. We're talking about classrooms, political speeches, international diplomatic meetings, and even video games, where different versions of this story continue to shape how people understand the world. Stalingrad transformed from a military engagement into something much more powerful, a symbol that different nations and ideologies have claimed, shaped, and reshaped across 8 decades. And here's what's fascinating. Each country remembers completely different lessons from the same battle. Let's start with Russia, because this is where Stalingrad holds almost religious significance. In Russian memory, the battle represents the supreme sacrifice that saved not just the Soviet Union, but all of human civilization from fascism. Every year on February 2nd, Victory Day celebrations feature Stalingrad veterans as living heroes, and the few remaining survivors are treated like saints. Walk through modern Volgograd, EIA. That's what Stalingrad was renamed in 1961, EIA, and you'll see that battle sites have been preserved as sacred memorials. The Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Complex is absolutely massive, featuring a statue called The Motherland Calls that stands 85 meters tall. That's taller than the Statue of Liberty. The entire complex is designed to make visitors feel the weight of historical sacrifice. But here's what's really interesting about Russian memory. It emphasizes the collective heroism of ordinary people, rather than individual military genius. Russian textbooks and memorials focus on factory workers who kept producing weapons under bombardment, on ferry crews who risked their lives nightly to supply the city, on civilians who chose to stay and fight rather than evacuate. This version of Stalingrad memory serves a very specific political purpose in modern Russia. It reinforces narratives about Russian resilience, about the willingness to sacrifice for the motherland, and about Russia's historical role as the defender of civilization against Western aggression. You can hear echoes of Stalingrad rhetoric in contemporary Russian political speeches about NATO expansion or sanctions. German memory is much more complex and conflicted. Wehrmacht veterans who survived Stalingrad described the battle in very different terms. They emphasized military professionalism versus political fanaticism, focusing on tactical achievements while minimizing strategic failures. In their accounts, German soldiers fought bravely and competently, but were betrayed by Hitler's impossible orders and political interference in military decisions. This version of memory served important psychological purposes for post-war Germany. It allowed German veterans to maintain pride in their military service while distancing themselves from Nazi ideology. They could honor fallen comrades without endorsing the political system that sent them to die in the ruins of Stalingrad. Post-war German military doctrine incorporated urban warfare lessons learned in Stalingrad's ruins, and these lessons influenced NATO training programs throughout the Cold War. German military academies studied Stalingrad as an example of how political objectives can override military logic with catastrophic results. The battle became a cautionary tale about civilian interference in military planning. But here's where it gets really interesting. American military institutions study Stalingrad for completely different reasons. They focus on it as the definitive example of urban warfare's unique challenges. American military academies examine how conventional armies struggle when fighting in populated areas against determined defenders using guerrilla tactics. The lessons from Stalingrad directly influenced American combat doctrine for conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, where modern armies have faced the nightmare of fighting in populated areas. The urban warfare techniques developed by Soviet defenders, AS, turning buildings into fortresses, using rubble for concealment, employing sniper teams to disrupt enemy morale, AC, these became textbook examples of asymmetric warfare. Urban planners around the world also study Stalingrad, but for different reasons entirely. They examine the battle as a case study in city resilience and infrastructure vulnerability. The destruction of Stalingrad demonstrated how urban infrastructure becomes weaponized during warfare, and this has influenced modern designs that consider defensive positions, evacuation routes, and civilian protection in conflict zones. Cities like Tokyo, London, and New York have incorporated Stalingrad lessons into their emergency planning. They've studied how essential services can be maintained during extended urban combat, how civilian populations can be protected in dense urban environments, and how infrastructure can be designed to remain functional even under bombardment. But the most fascinating aspect of Stalingrad's ongoing influence might be how the alternate history question, what if Stalingrad had fallen, continues to shape contemporary geopolitical analysis. Strategic planners and policy analysts use Stalingrad as a template for understanding how single battles can determine great power competitions. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet strategists modeled nuclear warfare scenarios using lessons from Stalingrad. They studied how urban warfare dynamics might apply to post-nuclear environments, how civilian populations might behave during extended urban combat, and how cities might function as military assets in global conflicts. The fall of the Berlin Wall and collapse of the Soviet Union created new contexts for Stalingrad memory. Eastern European countries that had been part of the Soviet sphere began developing their own interpretations of the battle's significance. Some emphasized liberation from Nazi oppression, while others focused on the beginning of Soviet domination. These competing memories created diplomatic tensions that persist today. When Russian leaders invoke Stalingrad's memory to justify contemporary military actions, as happened during the 2014 Ukraine crisis, SAT, it triggers responses from countries that remember Soviet victory at Stalingrad as the beginning of their own national tragedies. The rise of digital media and gaming has created entirely new battlefields for Stalingrad memory. Video games allow players to experience alternate history scenarios interactively, fighting the battle, with different outcomes. While historians debate the educational value of gamification, these platforms introduce millions of young people to counterfactual thinking and alternative history concepts. Virtual reality experiences now allow people to walk through reconstructed versions of wartime Stalingrad, experiencing the battle from multiple perspectives. These immersive technologies raise fascinating questions about historical empathy and understanding. Can experiencing a simulation help people understand historical events more deeply, or does it trivialize real suffering? Social media has also democratized historical memory in ways that would have been impossible in previous generations. Ordinary people can access primary source documents, debate historical interpretations, and create their own narratives about Stalingrad's significance. This has led to both greater historical literacy and the spread of conspiracy theories and pseudo-historical claims. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has given Stalingrad memory new relevance and controversy. Both Russian and Ukrainian narratives invoke the battle, but with very different messages. Russian media emphasizes parallels between fighting fascism in 1942 and fighting Western influence today. Ukrainian sources focus on resistance against foreign occupation and the defense of national sovereignty. These competing narratives show how historical memory becomes a weapon in contemporary conflicts. The same battle that united the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany now divides Russia and Ukraine in their interpretation of its lessons and legacy. Climate change researchers have also found unexpected relevance in Stalingrad's historical record. The brutal winter of 1942 provides valuable data for understanding how extreme weather events affect military operations and civilian populations. Scientists studying climate change impacts use Stalingrad weather records to model how future environmental challenges might influence geopolitical stability. Educational systems around the world teach Stalingrad differently depending on their national perspectives and pedagogical goals. Russian schools emphasize patriotic sacrifice and collective heroism. German schools focus on the dangers of totalitarian leadership and military adventurism. American schools highlight strategic decision-making and military logistics. These different educational approaches produce generations with fundamentally different understandings of the same historical events. A Russian student and an American student might learn completely different lessons from studying Stalingrad, which affects how they understand contemporary international relations and military conflicts. The scholarly study of Stalingrad continues evolving as new sources become available and analytical methods improve. Russian archives that were closed during the Soviet era have revealed new details about decision-making in Moscow. German. Documents discovered in private collections provide insights into Wehrmacht planning and morale. Oral history projects capture the memories of the last surviving participants before they're lost forever. As we'll see in our final chapter, this ongoing evolution of understanding demonstrates something profound about historical knowledge. It's not fixed or final, but constantly changing as new evidence emerges and new analytical tools become available. The Battle of Stalingrad refuses to stay in the past, continuing to influence how we understand war, sacrifice, decision-making, and the contingent nature of historical outcomes. So, here we are, 8 decades after the guns fell silent in Stalingrad, and I've got something absolutely mind-blowing to tell you. This battle, this single brutal engagement that lasted 6 months in one industrial city, refuses to release its grip on human imagination. It's like Stalingrad has taken on a life of its own, continuing to fight new battles in places the original combatants never could have imagined. Think about this for a moment. Right now, as you're listening to this, there are probably classrooms somewhere in the world where teachers are debating what really caused the German defeat. There are historians in archives uncovering documents that might change our understanding of key decisions. There are diplomats in international meetings, where national memories of Stalingrad clash over how to interpret contemporary conflicts. The battle that was supposed to end in February 1943 just moved to different battlefields. And here's what's absolutely fascinating. Each of these new battlefields reveals something different about why this story continues to matter so much. Let's start with what's happening in modern Volgograd, because this city has become like a living museum of conflicted memory. Every year, the city hosts international conferences where Russian, German, and Western historians attempt something that would have seemed impossible in 1943: reconciliation through shared scholarship. Picture these conferences for a moment. You've got descendants of German soldiers who fought in the ruins sitting across from descendants of Soviet defenders who tried to kill them. They're working together to piece together what actually happened, comparing German war diaries with Soviet after-action reports, trying to create a complete picture of the battle from all perspectives. But here's where it gets complicated. Political tensions periodically reignite old controversies. During the 2014 Ukraine crisis, Russian leaders started invoking Stalingrad's memory to justify contemporary military actions. Suddenly, historical scholarship became entangled with modern geopolitics, and those international conferences became much more tense affairs. The technology that's being used to study Stalingrad today would seem like science fiction to the people who fought there. Ground-penetrating radar locates buried bunkers that have been hidden under modern construction for decades. Metal detectors, operated by volunteer archaeologists, uncover personal artifacts, FTM, buttons from German uniforms, Soviet ammunition clips, personal letters that were never delivered. DNA analysis can now identify remains of soldiers from a dozen different nations. Just last year, forensic scientists identified a German soldier who had been listed as missing in action since November 1942. His family in Bavaria finally got closure after nearly 80 years of not knowing what happened to their grandfather. Each discovery adds another piece to this vast puzzle of understanding how this single battle changed everything. But here's what's really wild. Every new piece of evidence potentially changes our understanding of those alternate history scenarios we explored earlier. New information about German supply problems might make their victory scenarios less plausible. Previously unknown Soviet defensive preparations might make German success even less likely. The digital revolution has created entirely new ways for people to engage with Stalingrad's story. Video games and virtual reality experiences allow new generations to explore counterfactual scenarios interactively. Players can command German or Soviet forces and see if they can achieve different outcomes than what actually happened. Now, historians debate whether this gamification trivializes real suffering or actually helps people understand the complexity of historical decision-making. But there's no question that these platforms introduce millions of people to alternative history concepts and demonstrate how small decisions can cascade into massive consequences. YouTube channels devoted to military history regularly feature Stalingrad content that gets millions of views. Podcasts explore different aspects of the battle. Online forums host detailed discussions about tactical decisions and strategic alternatives. The democratization of information means that ordinary people can access primary source documents and participate in historical debates that were once limited to professional scholars. But this democratization has also led to the spread of conspiracy theories and pseudo-historical claims. Social media algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy can amplify sensationalized or inaccurate interpretations of Stalingrad. The same tools that allow for deeper historical understanding also enable the spread of historical misinformation. Climate researchers have found unexpected contemporary relevance in Stalingrad's historical records. The brutal winter of 1942 provides valuable data for understanding how extreme weather events affect military operations, civilian populations, and supply chains. Scientists studying climate change impacts use Stalingrad weather records to model how future environmental challenges might influence geopolitical stability and military conflicts. This connection between historical climate data and contemporary climate science demonstrates something profound about how historical knowledge remains relevant in unexpected ways. The same weather patterns that helped determine the outcome of a World War II battle now inform predictions about 21st century climate impacts. Educational technology has revolutionized how Stalingrad is taught in schools around the world. Interactive maps allow students to track the battle's progression day by day. Primary source databases let high school students read actual German and Soviet documents from the battle. Virtual museum exhibits provide immersive experiences that help students understand the human cost of urban warfare. But different educational systems continue to emphasize different lessons from the same battle. Russian curricula stress patriotic sacrifice and collective heroism. German educational materials focus on the dangers of totalitarian leadership and the importance of democratic civilian control over military forces. American textbooks highlight strategic decision-making and the logistics of modern warfare. These different educational approaches produce generations with fundamentally different understandings of the same historical events, which affects how they interpret contemporary international relations and military conflicts. A student educated in Russia will understand Stalingrad's lessons very differently than a student educated in Germany or the United States. The scholarly study of Stalingrad continues evolving as new archives open and analytical methods improve. Russian state archives that were classified during the Soviet era have revealed new details about Stalin's decision-making process and the real state of Soviet military capabilities. German documents discovered in private collections provide insights into Wehrmacht morale and tactical planning that weren't available to previous generations of Menschen. Historians. Oral history projects are racing against time to capture the memories of the last surviving participants before they're lost forever. Every month, another veteran dies, taking irreplaceable first-hand knowledge with them. These interviews reveal details about daily life during the battle that don't appear in official military records. 12.5. What it felt like to fight in -40-degree temperatures, how soldiers dealt with constant hunger and exhaustion, what ordinary people thought about while experiencing history's most brutal urban warfare. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are creating new possibilities for historical analysis. Computer programs can now process thousands of documents simultaneously, identifying patterns and connections that would take human researchers years to discover. These tools are revealing new insights about command decisions, supply chain problems, and tactical innovations that emerged during the battle. International relations. Scholars continue using Stalingrad as a case study for understanding how single events can reshape global power balances. The battle serves as a template for analyzing contemporary conflicts, where local engagements have global implications. Strategic planners study Stalingrad when modeling how regional conflicts might escalate into great power confrontations. The rise of China as a global superpower has created new contexts for interpreting Stalingrad's lessons. Chinese military academies study the battle as an example of how industrial capacity and mobilization can overcome initial military disadvantages. Chinese strategic thinkers analyze how geographic factors and supply lines influenced the battle's outcome, applying these lessons to contemporary scenarios in the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait. Space exploration has even found connections to Stalingrad's legacy. NASA researchers studying the challenges of establishing colonies on Mars examine how isolated communities can maintain morale and functionality under extreme stress. Some of their research references Stalingrad as an example of how human populations can survive and function in seemingly impossible conditions. The COVID-19 pandemic created unexpected parallels to Stalingrad's experience of siege and isolation. Public health officials studied how Stalingrad's population maintained essential services during extended crisis conditions. Urban planners examined how supply chains functioned when normal transportation networks were disrupted by warfare. These contemporary applications demonstrate something remarkable about historical knowledge. Events from the past continue providing insights for challenges that the original participants never could have imagined. The same human qualities that enabled survival in wartime Stalingrad, resilience, adaptation, cooperation under stress, ASE, remain relevant for 21st century challenges. But perhaps the most important lesson from Stalingrad's continuing influence is this: history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the forces and factors that shape human outcomes, recognizing patterns that repeat across different contexts, and learning how individual decisions combine with larger forces to create moments where entire futures hang in the balance. Stalingrad represents more than military history. It demonstrates how individual human decisions, environmental factors, technological capabilities, and sheer chance combine to create moments where the entire future hangs in balance. Understanding these inflection points helps us recognize similar moments in our own time and perhaps shape them more wisely. The ultimate lesson that emerges from our journey through Stalingrad's story is both humbling and empowering. The world we live in today, where democracy survived, where fascism was defeated, where international institutions exist to prevent global conflicts, wasn't inevitable. It resulted from countless individual acts of courage, strategic brilliance, and yes, favorable circumstances during those crucial months when the fate of civilization was being decided in the ruins of one industrial city. Every time we make decisions about war and peace, about international cooperation, about how to respond to authoritarianism, we're influenced by lessons learned from battles like Stalingrad. The ghosts of that frozen city continue whispering warnings about the fragility of civilization and the importance of the choices we make when history reaches its inflection points. And that's why this story will never really end. As long as humans face difficult choices with global consequences, as long as we struggle to understand how individual decisions cascade into massive changes, as long as we need examples of resilience and sacrifice and the contingent nature of historical outcomes, Stalingrad will continue fighting its battles in new arenas, teaching new lessons, and reminding us that the future is never predetermined. It's always being decided by the choices we make today. The battle that began in the summer of 1942 continues, just on different battlefields, with different weapons, but with stakes that remain just as high for all of us.